The doctor didn't sugarcoat it. Without the treatment, my daughter might not live to see her next birthday. I had already emptied my savings. Taken extra shifts. Asked everyone I could bring myself to ask. There was only one place left to turn. My parents. They listened quietly as I explained the numbers, the timeline, the urgency, and then my father said something that still echoes in my head. We can't risk our future for this. That was the moment I realized love, in my family, came with limits. And my child's life was one of them. We don't have that kind of money available. My father stood just inside the doorway of my apartment, arms crossed, voice steady, rehearsed. Behind him, my mother nodded quietly, lips pressed together as if agreement was easier than compassion. In the next room, my 6-year-old daughter, Lily, slept with the help of a humming oxygen machine. Every breath sounded like effort. Every second felt borrowed. Medical bills covered my kitchen table, lab results, invoices, denial letters. $92,000. That was the amount the specialist quoted for the treatment that could save her life. Her heart condition was rare. Aggressive. And no longer responding to standard care. Time was no longer on our side. My name is Rachel Morgan, I said softly, more to myself than them. I'm 29 years old, and I live in Des Moines, Iowa. I worked full-time as a daycare administrator. Nights, I waited tables. I raised Lily alone. Her father left when the diagnosis came. Said he wasn't built for this kind of life. That was 3 years ago. Realistic, I repeated, my voice cracking. She could die without this. The doctor had been clear. Maybe 5 months, if we were lucky. My mother stepped forward, resting her hand on my father's arm, the gesture she used when she wanted to soften a refusal without challenging it. Honey, we've helped where we could, she said gently. We paid for her earlier procedures. We can't risk our retirement now. I'm not asking for a gift, I said. I'm asking for a loan. I'll sign paperwork. I'll work more hours. I'll pay you back. My father shook his head. You're barely staying afloat as it is. That's not responsible. There are financing options. You should explore those. I had. Every one of them. High-interest medical loans. Payment plans that moved too slowly. Rejections based on existing debt. Lily didn't have years. She had months. I've tried everything else, I whispered. You're my last option. For a brief moment, my mother hesitated. Then my father spoke again. We can't do this, Rachel. We have to think about our own future. They left shortly after. I stood by the window and watched their car disappear down the street. The apartment felt smaller. Quieter. I walked into Lily's room and sat beside her bed, listening to the steady hiss of oxygen. Her chest rose unevenly. She looked peaceful, unaware that her grandparents had just decided her life was too expensive. That night, I made phone calls. Aunts. Cousins. Anyone who might help. Most offered sympathy. A few sent small amounts, kind gestures that barely scratched the surface. I was trying to fill an ocean with a spoon, and I didn't know it yet, but this was only the beginning. 2 weeks later, Lily collapsed at school. The call came while I was wiping down tables at the diner. Your daughter is on her way to Mercy Children's Hospital, the voice said. She's stable, but barely. I dropped the towel and ran. By the time I reached the emergency room, doctors were already moving with urgency, clipped voices, fast steps, no eye contact. Her heart was failing faster than expected. She needs the treatment, the cardiologist said quietly, pulling me aside. Sooner, not later. Weeks matter now. Weeks. I nodded like I understood, but my mind was already racing through numbers that didn't exist. That night, while Lily slept under fluorescent lights, I opened my phone again. GoFundMe. Medical aid foundations. Church programs I'd never attended. I wrote and rewrote Lily's story until the words blurred. I hated asking strangers to care when my own family wouldn't. The fundraiser went live the next morning, by evening. It had raised $4,300. People I didn't know left messages like "Stay strong" and "Praying for your baby." Their kindness felt heavier than my parents' silence. 3 days later, my sister Emily called. She sounded cheerful. Distracted. "Did Mom tell you?" she asked. "We finally booked the venue." "For what?" I said, already knowing. "The wedding," she laughed. "In Napa. October. It's going to be gorgeous." My stomach dropped. I said nothing. "Anyway," she continued, "Mom mentioned you've been stressed. This fundraiser thing, that must be exhausting." I swallowed. "They spent almost $200,000 on your wedding," I said quietly. There was a pause. "Well," she replied, "this is a once-in-a-lifetime event. You can't compare that to medical stuff." Medical stuff. I looked through the glass wall at Lily's hospital bed. Her chest rose unevenly beneath the wires. "I asked for $92,000, I said. "Not a wedding. Not a gift. Just help." Emily sighed. "You're making this uncomfortable," she said. "Mom and Dad have boundaries. You should respect that." Boundaries. I ended the call without replying. Later that night, my parents stopped by the hospital. They brought flowers. A small stuffed bear. My mother kissed Lily's forehead. My father avoided my eyes. "We talked," he said finally. "We still can't do the loan. But we can help with groceries. Or childcare if you need rest." I laughed. It surprised even me. "My daughter might not live to see her next birthday," I said. "And you're offering groceries." My mother's eyes filled with tears. "This is hard for us too," she whispered. But they still left without changing their answer. When the room fell quiet again, I sat beside Lily and held her hand. Her fingers were warm. Small. I promised her, silently, that I would not stop. No matter who turned away. And somewhere deep down, something hardened inside me, because love shouldn't be conditional. And family shouldn't be optional when a child's life is on the line. A week later, my parents hosted a family dinner. They didn't invite me. I found out through photos. My aunt posted them casually, wine glasses raised, soft lighting, everyone smiling. My parents sat at the head of the table. My sister Emily stood beside her fiancé, hand resting on her stomach as she showed off the dress-fitting photos on her phone. The caption read, "So excited for October." That same night, Lily spiked a fever. I sat on a plastic hospital chair while nurses adjusted monitors and whispered to each other. I opened my phone again and stared at the fundraiser. $11,870 raised. People with far less had given far more. I didn't plan to confront anyone. But exhaustion has a way of loosening restraint. The next morning, I drove straight to my parents' house. My mother looked startled when she opened the door. "Rachel, you should have called." "I did," I said. "You didn't answer." Inside, the dining table was covered in wedding magazines. Fabric samples. Guest lists. I stood there quietly, letting it sink in. "You found time for this," I said. "But not for the hospital." My father folded the newspaper slowly. "This is different." "How?" I asked. Emily entered from the kitchen, coffee in hand. "Oh my God," she muttered. "Are we really doing this now?" "Yes," I said. "We are." I pulled out my phone and placed it on the table, fundraiser page open. "She needs the treatment in 4 weeks," I said. 4. After that, the doctors can't guarantee anything. My mother's voice trembled. "We're not heartless," she said. "But this is complicated." "You spent more on flowers than what I'm asking," I said quietly. Emily scoffed. That's not fair, she said. This is my wedding. And that's my child, I replied. She's 6. Silence filled the room. Then my father spoke. If we help you, he said carefully, we'd have to help everyone. We can't set that precedent. I stared at him. I'm not everyone, I said. I'm your daughter. He looked away. My mother reached for my hand, then stopped halfway. You're asking us to choose, she whispered. I felt something break, clean and final. You already did, I said. Emily crossed her arms. You're being dramatic, she said. If something happens, it won't be because of us. That was when I stood up. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I simply looked at each of them. When you look back on this, I said, remember that you had a choice. I walked out. That afternoon, Lily's doctor called. Her condition had worsened again. They were moving her to intensive care. As I drove back to the hospital, my phone buzzed. A notification from the fundraiser. Anonymous donation, $25,000. I pulled over and cried for the first time in weeks. Not from relief, but from the realization that strangers were doing what family refused to do. And that changed everything. The anonymous donation changed more than the numbers, it changed the silence. Within hours, the fundraiser surged. Shares multiplied. Messages poured in from people who had never met Lily but somehow cared more than those who shared her blood. By morning, the total crossed $48,000. That's when my phone rang. My mother. Her voice sounded different this time. Careful. Uneasy. Rachel, she said, we've been getting calls. From who? I asked. Family. Friends. People asking questions. I leaned back against the hospital wall, watching nurses move in and out of Lily's room. What kind of questions? I asked. She hesitated. About the fundraiser, she said. About why strangers are paying for something we didn't. There it was. Not concern. Not regret. Exposure. I didn't tell anyone to ask, I said. I just told the truth. My father took the phone. You've put us in a difficult position, he said sternly. People are misunderstanding. No, I replied calmly. They're understanding perfectly. That afternoon, Emily showed up at the hospital. She brought coffee. And a tight smile. I didn't know it would blow up like this, she said, glancing at Lily through the glass. You knew everything that mattered, I said. She shifted uncomfortably. People are saying awful things online, she added. Mom's been crying all day. I didn't respond. After a moment, she sighed. Look, if this keeps spreading, it could affect the wedding. Sponsors are already asking questions. Sponsors. I stared at her. My daughter is in ICU, I said quietly. And you're worried about seating charts. She flushed. That's not fair, she snapped. You're making us look heartless. You did that yourselves, I replied. She lowered her voice. Maybe Mom and Dad could help a little, she said. Just enough to calm things down. I laughed, once. You had months, I said. You waited until it embarrassed you. Emily stood up abruptly. You always do this, she said. You make everything uncomfortable. No, I said. I make it visible. She left without saying goodbye. That evening, my parents came together. They stood at the foot of Lily's bed, hands clasped, eyes glossy. We've decided, my father said slowly. We can contribute $20,000. 20. After everything. My mother added quickly, as a gift. No expectations. I looked at them. At this point, I said, it's not about the amount. My father frowned. Then what is it about? Accountability, I said. And honesty. They didn't understand, not really. But for the first time, they were afraid of losing more than money. They were afraid of being seen. And once the truth is seen, it can't be taken back. The money came together quietly. Not all at once. Not from one place. But piece by piece, from teachers, former coworkers, neighbors, and people whose names I would never learn. 3 days before the deadline, the fundraiser crossed $93,000. I stared at the screen in disbelief. Strangers had saved my daughter's life. The hospital moved fast after that. Paperwork. Approvals. Late-night phone calls. The kind of urgency that means there's still hope, but no room left for mistakes. Lily was wheeled into surgery early on a Tuesday morning. I kissed her forehead and whispered the only promise that mattered. "I'm here," I said. "And I'm not going anywhere." The hours passed slowly. Too slowly. When the surgeon finally came out, his mask was off, and his eyes were tired, but smiling. "She made it," he said. "The procedure was successful." My knees gave out. I cried in the hallway, hands over my face, shaking with a kind of relief that hurt. Later that evening, my parents came by again. They stood awkwardly near the door, like visitors unsure of their welcome. My mother spoke first. "We heard the treatment went well." "It did," I said. My father nodded. "We're glad," he said. "We want to help now. With recovery. With expenses going forward." I looked at them for a long moment. "You already showed me how much you were willing to help," I said quietly. They didn't argue. Because there was nothing left to argue with. Emily sent a message the next day. "I hope Lily's okay." This got out of hand. I didn't reply. Some relationships don't end with shouting. They end with clarity. Months passed. Lily grew stronger. Her color returned. She laughed more. She ran, slowly at first, then faster. I moved us into a smaller place closer to the hospital. Life wasn't easy, but it was honest. My parents sent cards. Holiday texts. Invitations. I kept boundaries. Not out of anger. Out of protection. Because love that shows up only when it's convenient is not love I can trust with my child. One night, as I tucked Lily into bed, she looked up at me and asked, "Mommy, why did so many people help me?" I smiled and brushed her hair back. "Because," I said, "sometimes family is bigger than blood." And in that moment, I knew something for sure. I didn't lose my family. I learned who they really were, and I learned who I needed to be. For her. For myself.